Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. Much of the press has painted a grim picture of the COVID situation in Kerala, and there's no doubt, with cases growing at 22,000 a day and averaging 50% of the national total, it is a disturbing picture. But there's a lot else that simply hasn't got the attention it deserves. I refer to the state's seropositivity level, its vaccination achievements, its testing levels, its case fertility rate, and of course, its overall excellent healthcare. So when all of that is taken together, does the image of Kerala change? That's the key issue I shall explore today with Professor of Virology at the Christian Medical College in Vellore and a member of the COVID working group, Gagandeep Kang. Professor Kang, I want to spend this entire interview on Kerala. The state, as you know, represents 2 to 3% of the country's population, but at the moment, it's averaging 50% of the daily increase in COVID cases. How do you explain that?
I think the best explanation for what's happening in Kerala comes from the ICMR's fourth national serosurvey. If you look at the data there, the overall seroprevalence is about 68% countrywide, and in Kerala, it's only about 43%, which means that actually Kerala's done an outstanding job in controlling the spread of COVID so far. Unlike the rest of the country, where 2/3 or more of the people were infected, and some of that contribution is from vaccination, in Kerala, not only is a lower proportion positive, but a greater proportion of that positivity is contributed by vaccination, unlike the rest of the country. So what we are seeing now as a large number of cases, a large proportion of the national numbers coming from Kerala, is a result of Kerala having done a good job in flattening the curve of the pandemic.
Let me add to what you're saying, the vaccination figures from Kerala. I'll just repeat for the audience first the seropositivity ones. Kerala's seropositivity is said to be between 43 and 44%. The national figure is almost 68%. If you add to that the vaccination figures, you discover that Kerala has vaccinated fully just over 20% of its population compared to a national figure of around 7.5. When you look at single jabs, Kerala has achieved a 38% figure compared to a national figure of roughly 25%. Now, if you take the seropositivity along with the vaccination, would I be right in saying that this suggests that Kerala has done a much better job at protecting its people than almost any other state, both in terms of vaccination and in terms of the low seropositivity?
The figures speak for themselves. Yes, Kerala has done a better job in preventing the spread of infections and in vaccinating its population.
So in terms of Indian states, Kerala is right at the top in terms of protecting its people.
Absolutely.
Let me then come to something else. I notice that Kerala does an average of 140,000 tests a day. In fact, yesterday, it was just short of 2 lakh tests. I think the actual figure yesterday was 1,94,000. In comparison, Bengal, which is 3 times bigger in population terms, only does 50,000 tests a day. Secondly, the government's own seropositivity figures show that Kerala's strike rate is one for every 6 tests compared to a national rate of 1 for every 33. Does this suggest that Kerala has a large number of positive cases because it's doing far more testing than anyone else?
Well, Kerala is doing far more testing than the national average. So if you take tests per million for the population, Kerala does more than double what the rest of the country does. So not only is it testing more, it's also testing smarter. I think a lot of people raise this issue of test positivity rates and why is Kerala so high when it's supposed to be low. But actually, Kerala has a strategy for testing that is smarter than the rest of the country. I keep carrying on about why data on testing is important so that we know better reasons why people are being tested and what those test positivity results ultimately translate to. And in Kerala, you can find that information. Their testing is better targeted to contacts, to locations where they can better identify real cases. So the 1:6 detection ratio is way better, almost 3 times or more than that, better than the rest of the country is doing. So they are testing better, they are testing more, they are testing smarter.
When you say Kerala is testing smarter, are you suggesting that they're targeting the testing at people who are likely to be positive so they can weed them out and identify them, rather than doing more random testing? Is that what you mean by smarter testing?
Exactly. So I think one of the things that has distracted from the whole testing issue is that when you offer people a number or a rate that they are supposed to adhere to, and here I'm talking about test positivity rates being maintained under 5%. This is a system that can be gamed if that is the only thing that you're measuring. So what you do is you target your testing to places where you know that the yield is going to be poor. So you do a lot of testing where disease is low, your test positivity rate comes down. If, on the other hand, you do more testing where disease is high, you will pick up more cases and your test positivity rate will go up. So this is an opportunity for people to play games with numbers.
Absolutely, and this is a point made to us by Reader John in an earlier interview as well. He made it specifically with reference to how he believes in UP and perhaps even in Bihar, testing is being fiddled. They are doing more testing in areas where they know that test positivity is low, less testing in areas where the test positivity is high. And that ends up suggesting that, in fact, the incidence of the infection in their state is a lot lower than the truth. In Kerala, you're saying the opposite is happening. It's targeted testing, so more testing is happening in areas where positivity is high. That, as a result, picks up more cases. Secondly, Kerala is also doing a lot more testing than any other state. And so, for both these reasons, more testing and smarter targeted testing, Kerala ends up with a larger number of positive cases. And this leads people to believe that, in fact, COVID is being mishandled. But it's not being mishandled. Actually, the detection and the testing is being done better than anywhere else.
It is testing for public health action, and that's what you really want. To me, this is an indication of a state. It's not getting everything perfectly right. I think having celebrations for Eid, having election rallies was not the right way to go. But despite all of that, they have been able to manage their COVID problem better than pretty much any other state in the country. The southern states, particularly Tamil Nadu and Kerala, are doing very well in not overwhelming the healthcare system and using testing well.
Yesterday, I was interviewing Professor Brahma Mukherjee, who's a professor of epidemiology, biostatistics, and global public health at the University of Michigan. And she said, with specific reference to the fact that Kerala's seropositivity is just 43% compared to the national figure of 68%, she said, it's quite possible that Kerala's cases are rising at the moment because the state is catching up with the rest of India, not that Kerala is a threat to the rest of India. To what extent would you agree with that?
So I think there are two parts to that. One is I think we need to look at the distribution of variants. And it's very clear from even the limited amount of sequencing data that we have from different parts of the country that Delta got to Kerala later than it did to other parts of the country. And two, Yes, because Kerala has over 50% of its population as yet uninfected and unvaccinated, there is more fuel for the pandemic. But they have been able to manage their cases and spread them out so that their healthcare system has not been overwhelmed. And when you're dealing with a virus like this is a very sensible strategy.
Let me put to you two potential risks that seem to loom on the horizon. The first is the fact that Kerala's R number has now touched 1.2. Doesn't that mean that the number of people getting infected is steadily increasing? And that in turn means that the situation will get a little bit more worse before it starts getting better.
So I think the R coming up above 1 is a concern in any location, and it is an indication that more needs to be done. And one thing that we do have to remember about this pandemic is interventions you put in place today are going to show up in your R 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now. So any time your R is above 1, you need to think about what other interventions do we need to be putting in place. In Kerala, this could be restrictions on travel, this could be restrictions on movement, but they need to be done. You can't afford for your R to increase at this time. This is the problem really with exponential growth, or not quite exponential growth if you use Malcolm Gladwell. When do you get to the tipping point? I think when numbers are low, things are very unpredictable. As soon as numbers begin to become large, then the trajectory in the short term at least becomes more predictable. And I think Kerala is at that point where they need to be ensuring that something is being done to bring the R down.
And that's something you said should be restrictions on travel, maybe even restrictions on movement. In other words, something that sounds like partial lockdowns in perhaps targeted areas.
Well, I think the restrictions have to be that prevent interactions of infected people with uninfected and susceptible people. There are multiple ways you can do that. Restrictions on movement is one. All the non-pharmaceutical interventions that we have are obviously an approach to doing that. Improving vaccination and making sure that you have better isolation and quarantine are ways of handling this too.
Let me come to the second danger that could be looming in the situation that is present in Kerala at the moment. If incidence of cases is increasing, is there a danger that Kerala could become, unintentionally no doubt, a breeding ground for mutations?
Oh, absolutely. No question. Anywhere where you have unchecked replication of the virus is a potential place where variants and potentially dangerous variants can arise. Will it be Kerala? Will it be somewhere else? It's completely unpredictable. The one thing that I will say is Kerala actually got in on the Sequencing Act a bit earlier than many of the other states, and they have been able to tie up their sequencing data with their clinical information much earlier than many other people. So Vinod Skaria at the Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology has been working with the Kerala government to do sequencing prior to INSACOG and has continued to do so after INSACOG was established. I also know that the Kerala government has established an Institute of Virology, which is taking up sequencing that will go beyond INSACOG.
So what you're saying in that answer is that although cases in Kerala are increasing, and whenever cases increase, there's a danger of new mutations happening, Kerala nonetheless is trying to stay on top of it by effective genome sequencing done through the center you mentioned in Delhi and Mr. Skaria. And therefore, to the extent it can monitor the possibility of new mutations happening, Kerala is keeping its eye on the ball. It's not letting this ball drop.
And I certainly hope things stay that way for Kerala. They've done a good job so far, and I hope they continue to do so in the future.
One more question about Kerala, because this is another aspect of Kerala that isn't quite well understood outside the state. Cases may be increasing at a rate of 22,000 a day, but I noticed that hospital occupancy is under 50%. ICU occupancy is under 50%. Use of ventilators is under 50%. So though cases are rising, and that is a concern, no one denies it, but the healthcare system is not under stress. It's coping at the moment pretty adequately.
I think if you talk to doctors in Kerala, the additional burden of COVID is a lot, but it is not overwhelming. It's not the situations that we've seen in many other places where systems collapsed and people gave up. They are continuing to cope with the additional load. And as you mentioned, the bed occupancies and the usage of ventilators continues to be in a range that is comfortable for the state and the system. I will add to that that the mortality rate in Kerala has been not higher than anywhere else, if anything, slightly lower. There are arguments about that, but at least in terms of what is being reported out of Kerala, data on testing, data on hospitalizations, data on deaths, it seems to be indicating a health system that is functioning well.
In fact, on that point you make about mortality in Kerala, the figures that I have in front of me suggest that Kerala's case fatality rate is just 0.5 compared to a national average of 1.3, which means Kerala's is 1/3 almost of the national figure. Once again, a huge improvement.
It is, but I'll take a call on that once we have better data for the rest of the country, as well as somewhat better data from Kerala. If you look at what Rukmini and others have been doing with looking at excess mortality data, it seems to indicate that Kerala is doing better than almost any other state in the country in terms of the reporting that they're having and in the lower levels of excess mortality in Kerala. So as far as we know, and with reasonable quality data from Kerala, Kerala is doing well. It is not a concern for the rest of the country at this time, but it cannot afford to relax now.
In fact, on that point about excess mortality, I believe the figure is Kerala's excess mortality is only, I emphasize that word, only 1.6 times more than the official recorded COVID deaths. In other states, the gap is something like 30, 35, 36 times more. I'm talking about states like Madhya Pradesh, where in fact it's exceptionally high. So again, in comparison, Kerala is also very honest in admitting to the deaths that happened. They are not being hidden.
I think with most states, there is always some level of undercounting, which may not always be deliberate. So in Kerala being, 1.6 versus you would expect a perfect answer. So that level of undercounting exists. But in other states, what seems to happen is an almost incentivization to not report real numbers because you want to be ranked as having a higher level of performance. So I wonder really whether confidence in your health system comes again at a tipping point. When are you willing to admit to what you really have? And is it that we shouldn't even expect to see real data from states that have poor performing healthcare systems?
But what you're saying, Professor Kang, is Kerala is being more honest and truthful than other states. That's the bottom line of your position.
It seems pretty much like it.
In which case, we've come right to the end of this interview. How should we then sum up and give the audience a big but correct picture of the situation? There's no doubt. that if cases are increasing at 22,000 a day and averaging 50% of the overall national increase, it is a matter of concern. But on the other hand, as you explained it, Kerala's seropositivity suggests that in fact the population has been extremely well protected. As you said, Delta came later to Kerala than it did to the rest of the country. There is a sense in which Kerala successfully flattened the curve, but that flattening means that the dip will take a lot longer to happen than it did elsewhere. So what would be this overall picture that you would give the country? You did say Kerala is not a concern for the rest of India. Is that the overall picture, or would you go a bit further?
I think Kerala needs to continue to be careful, continue to monitor its cases, continue to test. I would probably ask that Kerala give us more data on what tests are being applied where, how much is RT-PCR and how much is rapid antigen, and the purpose for which that testing is being done. Now, targeted testing we know, but we don't have a breakup, let's say by district level, that we can match against seropositivity rate to look at the levels of control that are required for each district.
But would you also say to people who read the papers, look at the increase every day of cases in Kerala and start to panic, that is only part of the picture. Look at the full picture and you'll discover that in fact COVID is being handled rather well in Kerala, probably better than in most states. And Kerala, as you said yourself, is not a cause of concern for the rest of India.
I think if we just look at the numbers, that's a very small part of the overall picture, and it needs to be placed in context. And the context is that Kerala is doing a good job of testing, a good job of healthcare, and a good job of vaccination. Taking all of this together and making sure that Kerala continues its high level of surveillance, including genomic surveillance, I don't think we have a lot to worry about from this state. In fact, I think they should act as a model for other states in the country.
That is very well put. There's not a lot to worry about Kerala. In fact, Kerala should act as a model for other states. Professor Kang, thank you very much for opening our eyes to the big picture, putting things in perspective and explaining to the audience that they need to look beyond the daily figures the papers give them to the bigger, wider picture. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan, and goodbye.
Goodbye.